March 5th, 1979. Little Italy, Manhattan. The dinner rush had just ended. Plates clattered in the kitchen. Espresso hissed behind the bar. At the back table, the important men stayed seated. One man didn't belong there. His name was Carmine Mickey DeLuca, a mid-level gambling operator. Not a boss, not a made man, just close enough to power to feel safe. That night, he made a mistake no one in the room could ignore. He spoke without being asked. Witnesses would later remember the silence. Forks paused mid-air. A chair creaked. Someone laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because the decision had already been made. 3 days later, DeLuca's body was found in the trunk of a stolen Buick in Brooklyn. No gunshot wounds. No knife wounds. No blood. The coroner listed the cause of death as manual strangulation, with crushing trauma to the larynx. His windpipe had been deliberately collapsed. The official story said it was a gambling dispute, but the truth was far more dangerous. Carmine DeLuca didn't die for what he did. He died for where he spoke. And in the Mafia, speaking at the wrong table was worse than betrayal. Carmine Mickey DeLuca was not supposed to sit near power. He was born in 1941 in Red Hook, Brooklyn, a waterfront neighborhood built on longshoremen, union cards, and quiet arrangements. His father unloaded cargo ships. His uncle ran numbers out of a candy store. The boundary between work and crime barely existed. By the late 1960s, New York's Underworld was changing. Street rackets were evolving into sophisticated cash pipelines, sports betting, loan sharking, and illegal card rooms that never appeared on any city permit. DeLuca found his niche there. He wasn't violent. He wasn't feared. He was useful. He remembered faces, remembered debts, remembered who paid late and who paid quietly. He built relationships with bartenders, waiters, bookies, and small business owners who needed credit when banks said no. He collected envelopes and delivered them upward. Always upward. In Mafia terms, he was an associate, trusted enough to earn, but not trusted enough to belong. That distinction mattered. Associates lived in a permanent audition. They could earn millions and still remain outsiders. They attended weddings but never sat at the head table. They shook hands but never voted. They listened more than they spoke. By the mid-1970s, DeLuca was running a profitable sports betting network stretching from Brooklyn to Queens. Football Sundays alone moved tens of thousands of dollars in cash. Most of it never touched a bank. The money bought him proximity. Proximity bought him confidence. Confidence, in the Mafia world, was often mistaken for permission. And Carmine DeLuca was beginning to forget the difference. By 1976, Carmine DeLuca had become a familiar face in places he once would have avoided. Private card rooms above restaurants, back offices behind social clubs, after-hours dinners that began once the public left, rooms where conversations were spoken in half sentences and finished with eye contact. He never asked to be invited, but invitations started appearing anyway. It began with favors. A bookmaker needed a debt settled quietly. DeLuca handled it without threats. A club owner needed a new betting line spread across Queens. DeLuca delivered customers within weeks. A Shylock wanted his collections organized without police attention. DeLuca created a system that worked like clockwork. He didn't bring violence. He brought reliability. In organized crime, reliability could be more valuable than fear. Soon captains began to recognize him. Not as a soldier, not as family, but as a man who made money flow smoothly upward. Envelopes reached the right hands on the right days. No complaints. No headlines. No police pressure. He learned the rituals of proximity. Where to stand when bosses entered a room. When to laugh. When not to speak. Which jokes were not jokes. But the higher DeLuca climbed, the more dangerous his position became. He lived in the gray zone between insider and outsider. Too close to ignorance. Too far from protection. He was present during conversations meant for made men. Discussions about territories, gambling expansions, and disputes that could end lives. He heard names, numbers, plans, and every time he was allowed to stay in the room, the invisible line moved slightly forward. The problem with invisible lines is simple. You never know when you've crossed one. The dinner was never meant to include him. It was supposed to be a quiet meeting between a captain and two senior earners from another crew. Neutral ground. A restaurant used for decades because the owner never listened, and the staff never remembered. Carmine DeLuca arrived as part of the outer circle. A familiar face, a reliable earner, someone who could sit nearby, eat, and leave. The real conversation began after dessert. Coffee replaced wine. Chairs moved closer. Voices dropped. Waiters stopped approaching the back of the room entirely. The topic was gambling expansion. Atlantic City had begun reshaping the East Coast economy. Legal casinos meant new opportunities, but also new rules. Control of betting pipelines suddenly mattered more than ever. Whoever controlled the flow of bettors controlled the money. And control meant territory. Territory meant hierarchy. The captain at the table was explaining how the new revenue would be divided. Which crews would receive percentages. Which bookmakers would report to new supervisors. Which names would disappear from the chain of profit. DeLuca listened quietly. At first. Then he heard something that involved his operation. A redistribution. A percentage cut. His network reassigned under another crew's oversight. The room stayed silent. He didn't. He leaned forward and spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, but directly. He explained how his system worked, why changing it could disrupt cash flow, why the decision might hurt profits. He spoke like a businessman protecting a business, not like an associate interrupting a captain. The table did not respond immediately. Someone stirred their coffee. Someone adjusted their chair. The conversation moved on as if nothing had happened. But the meeting ended early. And Carmine DeLuca had just spoken at a table where he did not exist. In 1979, New York's Mafia was not just a criminal network. It was a political system. 5 families, dozens of crews, hundreds of earners, thousands of dependents. An underground economy moving billions of dollars through construction, unions, trucking, waste management, and gambling. At the top sat the commission, the invisible board of directors of organized crime. Their greatest fear was not the police, it was instability. The 1970s had already delivered too much chaos, internal wars, public assassinations, federal investigations expanding with new surveillance laws. Prosecutors were learning how to build conspiracy cases that targeted entire hierarchies instead of individual crimes. Public violence attracted attention. Attention attracted indictments. Indictments threatened the entire structure. So the rules became stricter. Hierarchy became sacred. Every conversation had a rank. Every chair had meaning. Every table had a boundary. Who could speak and when was not etiquette. It was power made visible. Because if associates began speaking like captains, and captains began speaking like bosses, the entire structure blurred, and blurred hierarchies created internal wars. When DeLuca interrupted that meeting, he didn't challenge a business decision. He challenged the order of speech. To outsiders, it sounded like a minor disagreement about money. To the men at that table, it sounded like something far more dangerous. Discipline had to be maintained quietly, swiftly, without debate. Not because of the money he questioned, but because of the precedent he set. If one associate could speak at that table, others might believe they could too. And in the Mafia, belief was contagious. The punishment did not begin with violence. It began with silence. The morning after the dinner, Carmine DeLuca started making calls. Routine calls. The same numbers he dialed every week. Bookmakers. Bar owners. 2 collectors in Queens. A driver who handled weekend cash pickups. No one answered. At first he assumed people were busy. Mondays were always slow. By Tuesday, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Calls went straight to voicemail. Meetings were postponed. A card game he helped finance was suddenly canceled without explanation. By Thursday, envelopes stopped arriving. Money didn't vanish in the Mafia without permission. Someone had turned off his access. DeLuca visited a social club in Brooklyn where he was usually welcomed without question. The door was unlocked. The television was on. Men sat at the card table. They nodded politely when he entered. But no one offered him a chair. No one asked him to stay. It was a message delivered without words. You are no longer inside. Isolation was the first stage of every organized crime execution. Cut the man off from income. Cut him off from allies. Cut him off from information. Because a man who realizes he is in danger might run. A man who believes this is temporary will stay. For weeks, DeLuca waited for a meeting that never came, an explanation that never arrived, a phone call that never rang. The system he built continued operating perfectly, just without him. By the end of February, he began asking the wrong question to the wrong people. What did I do? By then, the decision had already been made. March the 2nd, 1979. The call finally came. It arrived in the afternoon, casual and familiar. A voice DeLuca trusted. A meeting to clear up confusion. Dinner. In Brooklyn. Private. Quiet. Nothing to worry about. Relief is a powerful anesthetic. He arrived alone. Witnesses later remembered seeing him enter a small social club just after sunset. The same kind of place where he had spent years delivering envelopes and sharing drinks. A place that felt safe because it had always been safe. Inside, the mood was calm. Friendly. Almost apologetic. He was offered coffee. In Mafia culture, the setting of an execution was rarely chaotic. Violence was controlled. Efficient. Designed to avoid attention. Gunshots were loud. Knives were messy. Strangulation was different. Silent. Personal. Symbolic. At some point during the conversation, a man stepped behind him. Another moved to his side. There were no threats, no dramatic last words. Only hands moving with rehearsed certainty. The pressure came fast. Hands clamped around his throat. A forearm drove into the front of his neck. The force targeted the larynx, not the airway. A precise, brutal compression meant to collapse the windpipe itself. It was a message. He had misused his voice, so his voice was taken away. The entire act lasted less than 2 minutes. His body was transported that night. Placed in the trunk of a stolen Buick, parked on a Brooklyn side street where stolen cars were abandoned daily. When police discovered him 3 days later, the city barely noticed. But the people who mattered understood perfectly. The police treated the case as routine. A known gambling associate. No witnesses willing to speak. No murder weapon. No obvious suspects. The medical examiner documented the injuries with clinical precision. Fractured laryngeal cartilage. Severe compression trauma to the neck. No defensive wounds. A controlled killing. Close contact. More than one attacker. The file moved quietly into the growing archive of unsolved organized crime homicides. Inside the underworld, the message traveled much faster. No announcement. No celebration. Just a subtle shift in behavior. Bookmakers adjusted their reporting chains without protest. Weekly envelopes resumed their journey upward. The gambling network DeLuca built continued producing money with mechanical reliability. Only one thing changed. No associate spoke during meetings again. Captains noticed the effect immediately. Conversations became shorter. Quieter. Questions disappeared. Younger earners listened with exaggerated discipline, nodding before they understood, agreeing before they were asked. The lesson had been delivered without public violence, and that made it more effective. For the crew that absorbed DeLuca's operation, the benefits were immediate. Expanded territory. Increased percentages. Stronger control over Atlantic City pipelines. Stability returned to the hierarchy. The system had corrected itself. In the Mafia, success was measured not by who died, but by how quickly business continued afterward. And business never paused for long. March 5th, 1979. Little Italy. Manhattan. The dinner table where Carmine DeLuca spoke still existed. The same chairs. The same espresso machine hissing behind the bar. New conversations replaced old ones. New names replaced his. Nothing in the room changed. That was the point. Organized crime was never sustained by violence alone. Violence was only the punctuation. The real language of the Mafia was structure, a rigid hierarchy built on silence, ritual, and invisible boundaries. DeLuca believed he was protecting a business. The men at the table believed they were protecting a system. One spoke about money, the others enforced order. And in their world, order mattered more. His death was not dramatic, not public, not memorable outside the circles that understood it. There were no headlines, no televised manhunts, no courtroom speeches, just a quiet correction, because the Mafia does not fear mistakes. It fears precedent. If one associate could speak at the wrong table, the invisible lines would blur. If the lines blurred, authority weakened, and if authority weakened, the entire structure could collapse. So the lesson was delivered in the most symbolic way possible. The man who spoke out of turn lost the ability to speak at all. In the end, Carmine DeLuca's story reveals the central truth of organized crime. Power is not enforced through chaos, but through discipline so absolute that even a sentence spoken in the wrong room can become a death sentence.